I'm going to try and talk to you tonight about some ideas that I think have relevance to what I understand, and I don't have a deep understanding of Korzybski. The thing that, of course, I know best is his famous saying, the map is not the territory, etc. And I also discovered that I'm probably engaging in time binding. But you will see, I think, how relevant the idea of the map and the territory becomes as I explain some of the ideas I'm here to talk to you about. I think what I'm going to start with is a bit of a personal journey, because it sometimes it makes things easier to understand if you realize why it is that I ended up doing things, especially if they're so formidably strange as to write a book about the difference between the two brain hemispheres. My scientific colleagues all stopped working on this topic a long time ago because they knew it was all rubbish. And if I mentioned that I had an interest in lateralization, their eyes would sort of glaze over with a mixture of boredom and pity, and they would think, what happened to poor old McGilchrist? Well, what happened was a sort of personal journey of a kind. At school, I was aware of a number of things about the world that I felt intuitively were true, but they didn't follow from what I was being taught at school at all. In fact, they were probably incomprehensible in those terms strictly. They were some ideas I can express quite succinctly. The idea that the whole is not the same as the sum of the parts. The idea that the world is not just inert and unresponsive to us, particularly the natural world. The idea that opposites tended to coincide as much as diverge. That history moved in spirals rather than in linear trajectories. And that the intellect's tendency to abstract, classify, and generalize went in the precise opposite direction to the business of the cosmos, as I perceived it, which was all to do with embodiment, differentiation, and uniqueness. So those were ideas that certainly weren't instilled into me. And I don't think I read them anywhere in particular, but they've stayed with me all my life. And latterly I've discovered philosophers who will give me very good reasons for believing these things, but I'm not sure that that's ever been why I believed them. They were probably intuitions of what I suggest was going on in a part of the brain, part of my mind, that was observing, understanding, but not able to articulate. Because of my interest in this, well, let me be frank, I thought I was going to be ordained and become a monk, and it's a jolly good thing for everybody, including me, that actually that's an idea I abandoned as I got to university and discovered I probably wasn't made out of the right stuff. But I did approach Oxford to read philosophy and theology. And I went up for interview, and my interviewers were Tony Quinton, the philosopher, and because I had to do the entrance exam in a school subject, which wasn't philosophy or theology, I chose English almost at random, and so I was examined by John Bailey, who's nowadays best known as the husband of Iris Murdoch, but is in fact a very distinguished literary critic in his own right. Well, he's now died, alas. And Christopher Tolkien, son of J.R.R., who was destined to become my Saxon tutor. And they said, look, you can't do philosophy and theology, it's not an honours degree. You must do an honours degree. Well, it may seem very strange in an era in which you can literally, look it up, get an honours degree in Frisbee, that you couldn't in 1971 in Oxford get an honours degree in philosophy and theology. What Tony Quinton suggested was that I did PPE, philosophy, politics and economics, but having not the slightest interest in either politics or economics, I thought this was a bad idea, and I was persuaded I ought to do English, which I did. But I found there were certain problems with it. I very much enjoyed my time. and on the basis of it I got a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, as you've heard. And I wanted to articulate there some of the problems I'd had with the business of academic lit crit. It seemed to me that people in the past who lived before me had written things because they wanted to communicate something of very deep and special importance, and that something was embodied in the work of art, in the poem, in whatever it might be, in a piece of music, of course, or a painting, but in my case, as a literary critic, usually in a poem. And apart from being embodied, it was also implicit. If you tried to paraphrase it, the meaning disappeared. Like explaining a joke, it lost all its power. And on top of that, it was entirely unique. If Hardy had not written poems, if Hopkins had not written poems, we couldn't have imagined them. There'd be a Hardy or Hopkins-shaped hole in the universe where their work belongs. And that's true, I think, of all great art, that it can't be substituted or in any way, it has a uniqueness about it. So there's the work of art, unique, embodied, and implicit. And along comes the critic and turns it into something general, abstract, and explicit. And it seemed to me this was a very odd thing to be doing that worked in the exact opposite direction to the work of art. And explained why sometimes when you came to criticize great writers, and I thought of Sam Johnson in particular, and Lawrence Sterne, and the poet Wordsworth, all of them at the top of what they did in terms of essayist, novelist, and poet, when you started to write about them, you found that they were full of all sorts of imperfections, but you couldn't see really where the greatness of them lay. And that led me to write a book called Against Criticism, which was published by Faber in 1982 and was unceremoniously pulped about a couple of years later. And it's rather gratifying to find that if you now want to buy a copy of it, there is one on Abe Books at the moment going for £1,782. In any case, while I was trying to articulate these ideas, why is it that things are different when they're implicit from when they're explicit? Why is it that things are disembodied and decontextualized as soon as we start to think about them? I was really struggling and trying to find ways of expressing it because language kept taking me back to the idea that no, the whole is just the sum of the parts. You take the thing out of the context, it's still the same thing, etc., etc. And I was sitting at lunch, I had the good fortune to be sitting at lunch with a very fine sinologist, David Hawkes, a great Chinese classical scholar, and he was asking me very kindly about my work. I explained my problem. He said, oh, the Chinese have words for the things that you can't say in English, which made me think. And for a while I thought of becoming a sinologist, but I have a tendency to become a sort of eternal student, and it probably wouldn't have been a good excursion. At the time, what really struck me was that the problem was something to do with the mind-body relationship, that the work of art, even the literary work, the poem, was a very physical thing, that it affected you physically, and it was itself physical. It couldn't be cerebralized. It had an effect on your blood pressure, on your pulse, on your breathing. It could make the hair stand up on your body. It could bring tears to your eyes. Just in reading it and speaking it, you could feel the skeletal musculature responding as in a kind of dance to the words. So there was something wrong with this, and I started to go back to my earlier interest in philosophy, this time with psychology. And I went to the various seminars on mind-body relationship, but in brief, I found them all too disembodied in their approach. I could have sat in a seminar room in Oxford underground for years talking about embodiment without really getting there. And of course, in those days, and probably still actually in Oxford, Merleau-Ponty was either unmentioned or certainly not a core part of what anyone would have considered. It was all the rather, to me, arid tradition of Anglo-American analytic philosophy. But what struck me was the very practical work of Oliver Sacks. And it was around the time that Awakenings came out. And if you haven't read it, I do recommend it. If you've seen the film, that's got nothing to do with it, largely because much of the beauty of it lies in its extensive footnotes, which in those days he was allowed to put at the bottom of the page where I wanted to put mine. And I found it a wonderful read, and it inspired me that here was somebody who could write about embodied being that connected the mind and the brain and the body as one. And I've determined that really the way to do this was to go off and study medicine and work at the interface between neurology and psychology. So I did that. And I ended up at the Maudsley, where I was under the tutelage of Professor Alwyn Lishman, very great figure in the history of organic psychiatry. In fact, he wrote the classic text, Organic Psychiatry. Organic in those days, it's a sort of slightly outmoded idea, because in those days people thought there were sort of mental conditions and brain conditions, but in any case it was looking at the brain roots of psychological states, psychopathological states. And during that period in which I was learning psychiatry, and I'd done a bit of neurology and neurosurgery very briefly before I went there at the Wessex Neurocentre. I was very interested in this whole business of the brain and its effect on our thinking, and particularly by the idea of lateralization, partly because of some things I'd noticed in my patients. Anyway, one day there was a poster up saying that a man I hadn't heard of, Dr. John Cutting, who was a member of the Institute of Psychiatry, was going to give a lecture on the right cerebral hemisphere and psychiatric disorders. Now, that intrigued me, because in medical school, we'd learned a lot about the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere didn't do anything. It was a sort of bit like those maps in the old days where it said, "Here be dragons." Nobody had any idea really what it was for. Probably it was a sort of companionship exercise, and if anything went wrong with the left hemisphere, the poor old right hemisphere, which wasn't much good for anything, would step in and try and take over. So I was intrigued that here was a psychiatrist who's going to talk about the right cerebral hemisphere and psychiatric disorders. And I went along, and I could hardly believe what I heard. It was a literally life-changing event, and I could so easily have just had another cup of coffee. But anyway, there I was. And what he was saying, he just completed writing a book published by OUP called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. You'll be amazed to learn. And it's become a classic in its own right. And what he talked about was, which I hadn't heard in medical school, that the right hemisphere had all sorts of qualities. The reason I hadn't heard about them was because most medics are in a hurry. I mean, they're practical people. They've got a lot to do. And if somebody has a left hemisphere stroke, quite often they can't speak and they can't move their right hand. And even a busy medic can spot that. But what happened after a right hemisphere stroke? You went to the bedside and the patient said they were fine, thank you, and you sent them home. Actually, it turned out that they were not fine at all, and that it is much more difficult to rehabilitate people after right hemisphere strokes than after left hemisphere strokes, even though the left hemisphere stroke involves loss of speech, loss of use of the right hand for most people. Pretty critical. Anyway, John had spent 20 years sitting at the bedside of people who'd had disorders of the right hemisphere and noting what happened to their world. And the fact is that their whole world changed. If I can give you a soundbite, after losing faculties in the left hemisphere, what happens is you can't utilize the world. You can't manipulate the world using your right hand and using language. But you can understand it fine. What I'm saying is a bit of a generalization, but it's broadly right. And after a right hemisphere stroke or injury, the world itself is completely different in many ways. And some of the ones he mentioned were that you no longer can read implicit meaning. You can't understand anything unless it's absolutely literally spelled out. That after a right hemisphere stroke, tone, in the sense of both the the way in which something is said, the tone of voice in which it's said, whether there's irony, sarcasm, humour, all those things disappear. You can't read faces or body language, which is the other very important implicit ways in which we communicate, in which we're in fact said to communicate more than we ever do by language. He was saying the right hemisphere is interested in the unique case. The left hemisphere wants to generalize from those unique cases. He said the right hemisphere is more in touch with the body. It is actually the hemisphere that has the body image in it, which is not just a visual image, it's an image in all sensory modalities. And it has richer connections with the limbic system and through that to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the body's autonomic responses. All this was totally fascinating to me because what I realized was the right hemisphere can't speak, but it sees all these things. It sees the implicit. It sees how the whole is not what is broken up into parts. It sees things in context. It sees things as embodied. So afterwards I went up and had a few words with him, and I lent him a copy of my book, Against Criticism, which he kindly read and found interesting, and we worked together for a while on research projects, which he very generously allowed me to take part in. And it began the beginning, well, it was the beginning of my 20-year attempt to familiarize myself with the literature on hemisphere difference, which was a difficult thing because most neuroscientists weren't interested in giving you any advice on it except not to touch it with a barge pole. And when you actually went to the literature, most of the stuff one had was going back a little in time because people had been frightened off the topic. However, I found that there were animal ethologists who were interested in it, and that gave me a lot to think about. Anyway, in the middle of all this, I was offered a research fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and I went over there to the neuroimaging lab and worked on abnormalities of asymmetry in the brain in schizophrenia. One of the interesting findings in schizophrenia is that the normal asymmetry of the brain is either reversed or absent, and that was a fascinating thing in itself, and I spent time imaging various areas of what's called heteromodal association cortex, which are the areas of the brain which are supposedly involved with the highest level at which we bring our experience together in consciousness. And these are, interestingly, all in asymmetrical areas, and they're all the areas that are particularly significantly aberrant, if you like, in schizophrenia. While I was at Johns Hopkins, I was thinking a lot about American life, which differed from English life. The first thing was that I found that, if I may say so in your company, that sometimes I was misunderstood because what I was saying was ironic or implicit. And a lot of people looked at me in a very puzzled way for quite a long time. And then I realized I think I'd better drop that and just state exactly what I mean. And I noticed also that in the university there were interesting handbooks being given around to the students explaining how to date a member of the opposite sex. Now, I do understand the worries that are behind this, and they're very legitimate ones, and I don't want to take away from that, but it does seem to me that there's something up with the human race when one has to read a handbook on how to, as it were, approach a member of the opposite sex. But what I was getting at was that there seemed to be a tendency, because America is always the future. Whatever happens in America, 5 years later, it hits us in Europe. I was thinking, my God, we're entering into an era of extraordinary explicitness about everything, and abstraction and generality. So I was fascinated to receive an excited postcard from John Cuttings, this was long before email, saying, I've just read the most extraordinary book, and you must read it immediately. What was that book? It was a book which just came out in the year I was in Hopkins, 1992, a book called Madness and Modernism, subtitled Insanity in the Light of Modern Art, Literature and Thought, by Louis Sass. Sass is a distinguished professor of psychology at Rutgers, and this book was the other changing point in my intellectual career. I spent 2 years reading it, thinking about it, and generating a review of it in one of the London journals, the London Review of Books. But in the process, it completely altered the way I thought about many things. It's an incredibly rich book. If you don't know it, again, you must read it. It's beautifully written. It draws together psychology, philosophy, the arts in a way that is seldom achieved. And I found it packed with insights. So this set me thinking, because what the thesis of this book was, that there were very strong parallels between the phenomenology of schizophrenia and modern life. Modernism and its ways of thinking, behaving, and responding to the world. Now, that was extraordinary because, of course, we haven't all suddenly developed schizophrenia. But in terms of what I was working on in the brain, and it's something that Louis Sass hinted at in an appendix, the right cerebral hemisphere is what is clearly not functioning properly in schizophrenia. So another way of looking at we behave in a rather schizophrenic-like way or think in such a way is that we are thinking in the way, behaving in the way, viewing the world in such a way as someone would who had damage to their right hemisphere and a sort of pathological overdrive of their left hemisphere. I was electrified by this idea and immediately started thinking back through the work I'd done in the history of ideas and the history of literature to think how in other eras, knowing what we know about the two hemispheres, would one see them? How would one see the evolution across time of a different preponderance? Were there times when things were more in balance? Were there even times when the right hemisphere, as it were, led? It turned out that there weren't. That's something I can comment on later. But there were certainly times when things were very much more balanced than they are now. And so I wrote this very long, hubristic book, modestly entitled The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, in which I run through the history of the Western world from the Greeks through to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, Modernism, and Postmodernism. Absurd task, of course, in half a book, 300 pages, but what I do is to do it simply through the lens of what we have learnt about the two hemispheres. Now, what have we learnt about the hemispheres? The internet is full of material of this kind. This one I put up with the health warning right and wrong, but it comes from one of the better websites, actually, but I'm afraid it's utter baloney. There is actually only one pairing there that is correct, and I'll offer a free pizza to anyone who can spot it. But basically, sorry? The second one. Free pizza for that man. But actually, all the others are complete and utter nonsense. So forget just about everything you've heard about the division of the brain. Of course, the first question is, why is the brain divided at all? It's not a question I'd ever heard anyone ask. It's just assumed that there it is, almost as though embryology made it that way, and that's the way it's got to remain. But of course, lots of things in embryology or in history, as it were, in the history of mankind, took a completely different form from the one in which they end up in the modern adult human being. So there's a puzzle, because here you see this rather lugubrious-looking gentleman has allowed the top of his head to be taken off and the scalp peeled down, and he's impatient for the procedure to be over. But here you see that the left hemisphere has been drawn aside to reveal the corpus callosum in the middle there, which is a band of fibers that connects the hemispheres at their base. Only 2% of neurons are actually directly connected across this structure. And one of the puzzles about it is that over evolution, the size of it in relation to the brain has got smaller, not larger, and that also much of its function is in fact inhibitory. Although excitatory neurons cross the corpus callosum, often glutamatergic, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, they in most cases are then going to be mediated via at least some neurons which are inhibitory GABAergic neurons. So this is a very interesting thought, because if the brain exists to make connections, that's its entire purpose, and its entire power exists in doing so, why have this bipartite structure? I just put this up briefly to suggest that although connections across the brain are going to be important, there are massively important tracks that unify each hemisphere as a unit on its own. These are late myelinating, they are highly developed, they're very important for the developed human adult. The uncinate fasciculus and the superior longitudinal fasciculus. When I say myelinate, that means they're sheathed in white myelin, which makes them transmit fast. So these are like superhighways of the brain. And they are, the reason I put it up really is to illustrate that a hemisphere is not just a lot of little modules working on their own, but is highly interconnected within itself, much more so than it is connected with its opposite number. And of course, this goes with the knowledge we have from people who've had a hemisphere destroyed by disease or by surgery for epilepsy. And in these cases, a single hemisphere is perfectly able to sustain the consciousness of a human being. Of course, there are interesting things that happen as a result of that, and I'm not going to particularly go into those tonight. Some of them will be familiar to you. This is really just to emphasize that the brain is asymmetrical. We're looking at it from the bottom here. Somebody once said to me, what's that interesting white button on top of the brain? It's not actually a white button on top of the brain, it's the top of the brain stem. So you're looking up your own spinal cord at the base of the brain. And by a helpful anatomical convention, the right hemisphere is on the left and the left is on the right. But what you see there is that if you compare the posterior part of the brain, which is towards the bottom of the picture, on the right and the left, you'll see that it's more extensive on the left. It's more expanded, and it pushes back and over the midline. This was always said in medical school to be because of the important thing about humans is they have language, and language has to be kept under one roof, and it just happened to be under the roof of the left hemisphere, and it's caused a bulge. Well, bulge or not, that's bilge, and I will talk more about why it is later. What was not talked about in medical school was the biggest asymmetry in the brain, which is actually in the right frontal cortex. If you look at the top of the picture and compare at the front of the brain there, the right hemisphere, which, as I say, is on your left, is broader and juts forward more than the counterpart on the left. That was ignored largely because it was an embarrassment, because, of course, we know the right hemisphere doesn't do anything. So this is the book in which I dared to suggest that there was something going on, and the best 10 quid or $10, I think, now the exchange rate is since Brexit, so the best $10 you'll ever spend. To begin with, I needed to get a bearing on this, and I went back to the animal ethologists. There are a lot of very good scientists there. Humbler people, I think, than some of the human neuroscientists. Human neuroscientists are a rather proud lot. I mean, they don't like the fact that people do things like have an advert, the Volvo, to car for your right brain. They go, oh, tacky, we can't go there. So please don't touch it. But however, animal ethologists just did what scientists are supposed to do, which is to observe and record and have a think. So they did a lot of observing and recording and having a think, and what they discovered was that birds and animals tend to use their right and left hemispheres for quite different things. It's easy to spot this in many birds and in some animals when they have eyes on opposite sides of the head. The reason being that the right eye wires across straight to the left hemisphere and the left across to the right hemisphere. Unfortunately, it's not that simple in human beings because we have eyes on the front of our heads, partly so that we can judge distances when swinging from branch to branch, as I usually do on a Sunday afternoon. And that process involves a business where the left visual field of each eye goes to the right hemisphere and the right visual field of each eye goes to the left. So it's slightly more complicated. Anyway, back to birds and animals. You can actually see what they're doing. And what was this big difference? Well, they were solving a very important problem of survival. They were they were involved in a Darwinian solution to the conundrum, how do I eat and stay alive? And I know that doesn't look difficult here tonight, but it is actually a very difficult problem for most creatures, because in order to eat, or indeed to get things to manipulate, to pick up a twig to build a nest, you've got to have a very narrowly focused, very sharply focused attention to a tiny detail, that seed against that background of grit or whatever. And if that's all you're doing while you're getting your lunch, you'll soon become somebody else's. So you have to have a different kind of attention at the exact same time, which is broad, open, non-committed as to what it will find. And the only way that can actually be achieved is by having two neuronal masses, each capable of attention, which means each capable of consciousness, because attention is simply how you apply your consciousness to the world, and able to do so differently at the same time. That, ladies and gentlemen, in brief, is my hypothesis as to why we have developed, why all creatures that we have looked at have two separate neuronal masses, and of course they've developed their own special, I will come on to, their own special qualities in human beings, but broadly speaking that is a deep reason for a profound difference that lies at the heart of every living thing. Now that attention changes the world. The reason I've put this fellow up here, by the way, he's called a common garden lizard. It's a bit of a shame. He's rather a fine chap. But anyway, what he does is he looks out for predators while he's getting a fly, and so you can experiment with him. And what they did was they brought in an image of a predator, and they put it on the side where the left eye would normally regard the thing, and that left eye is, of course, feeding to the right hemisphere, which is interested in watching out for the broad picture, the broad sustained vigilance for predators. But experimentally, they taped over the left eye, and what this guy does is, even though he's spotted by looking straight ahead, he sees the predator, he tries to eye it with the left eye, preferentially to the right hemisphere, even though his left eye is not available. And you can also see birds and animals using tools, and I'll explain why that's significant, using like sticks, and they use the right eye, which feeds, generally speaking, to the left hemisphere in most of these birds. They will do that even when doing so is more difficult, even when it makes the task more difficult. So there is a distinction. I may come back to that. Now, this is the place I left yesterday. Yes, it was yesterday morning. Can it be? I can't believe it. Anyway, this is the place I left. And this is a place called Talisker on the Isle of Skye. Those of you who know your whiskey will recognize the name well. Anyway, the name Talisker is given by this sloping mountain, which is behind my house, because Talisker in Norse means the sloping rock. And what that means is that this mountain meant something very specific to the Norsemen that came there 1,000 years ago, which was that this bay is notorious for shipwrecks, and this was the landmark that meant safety or danger. So it had very specific meaning for them. We know also that there were Picts living in the shadow of it because their brochs are still there to this day, and to them this mountain meant shelter and it meant the home of the gods. In the 18th century, travellers started to come and draw and paint, and for them it was a many-coloured, many-textured form of beauty. To geologists who started coming around the same time, it is an extraordinary, exemplary, in fact, example of columnar basalt formation. To a speculator, it's $1 million if you can get that basalt out. over my dead body. And to a physicist, of course, who knows really what things are, it's 99.99% space, and the rest of it is only probably there, and we don't know what it's like. So all of those are perfectly real descriptions of a mountain. None of those is more real than any other. They are each perfectly valid experiences of that mountain. And just saying, well, it's really just a lump of rock doesn't help at all, because that's already loaded with all kinds of values of its own, and is a very, very special way of thinking about it. In fact, you'd have to be pretty much autistic to think of it in that way. So what occurred to me rather late in the day, because I was a bit slow on the uptake, was this difference in attention is world-changing, literally, because the world is only composed by our attention. We only know the things that we know, and we only know them by the way we attend to them, and how we attend to them changes what there is. So these two hemispheres should subtend two completely different worlds. Does that make sense? Well, how are we supposed to know what's what, and where do we begin? I rather like this picture by Escher, because it suggests that there is no single truth that we can establish, and then work forward immaculately down the road to truth in an obsessional way, making sure of each step before we go. Because everything begs its own foundations. It's like that serpent that eats its tail. We have to make a leap into understanding at some point. We can't have a privileged path. Now, the interesting thing about that is that when you leap in, depending on the attention you pay, you will see certain things and not others. And they will be the things that respond to the kind of attention you're paying. So if you think this body, this human body, is a machine, then you are modeling it on a machine. And when you come to look at it, you find all sorts of aspects of it that seem mechanical. Of course you do, because that's the way you're looking at it. And the more you do that, the less you see anything else, and the more you think the machine model is brilliant. And that will work with whatever model you start with, because it helpfully obscures all the things that don't fit with the model. And as they say, to a man with a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. So how you start to look at the world really makes a difference. The right hemisphere is, as I say, the one that has this broad open attention, but the left hemisphere has an attention to getting things, and it controls, for most of us, the right hand with which we grasp things, and its mode of vision is very narrow. About 3 degrees out of the 360 arc is that, I shouldn't say vision, I should say attention. The attentional arc is narrow, and after a right hemisphere stroke, people have what's called a pathological narrowing of the window of attention. So for the left hemisphere, A leads to B, as my intention to get that insect means I grab it and pick it and eat it. But for the right hemisphere that sees a whole complex, interconnected, living world, A doesn't lead to B. In fact, it looks like it takes quite a detour, such as my Uber had to take getting me back from lunch today. Yes, okay. I'm going to suggest that one of the things that happens, I'll explain what I mean by this, is that the right hemisphere gives depth to life, in every sense of that word depth. Isaiah Berlin commented that depth is a very important idea that philosophers hardly ever deal with. And nonetheless, it can't be substituted by any other idea. When you say that something is deep, you don't just mean that it's clever or interesting or beautiful or special, you mean something rather particular. And in three very obvious ways, depth disappears from the world when there's damage to the right hemisphere. One is depth in space. Another is depth in time. And I haven't got a lot of time to go into that tonight, but I'm writing a book about it. And depth in feeling, in emotion. So emotion and relationship to the world becomes superficial. Vision becomes flattened as if virtual or on a screen. And time becomes segmented into a series of stills. It becomes digitalized rather than analogous. And this illustrates at least the spatial aspect quite nicely. It's from Gazaniga and Ledoux. Here you have a patient before the split brain operation. This was an operation that was instigated in Caltech in the 1960s by Joe Bogan, and got Roger Sperry a Nobel Prize for the work he did on the patients who'd had the procedure. Because after this procedure, which involved cutting the corpus callosum, separating the two hemispheres, it was possible to interrogate one hemisphere at a time. And it was how we began to know something about hemisphere differences. Sperry himself thought the two hemispheres not only thought differently, but actually had different personality characteristics and different values. So that was an interesting observation, which has gone out of fashion, but is beginning to come back in again as we learn more. Anyway, here you have a patient before the operation, preoperative, the top line. So they've been asked to draw a cube. And you can see that both the left hand and the right hand do a passable job at representing a cube as it's experienced. But after the operation, it's only the left hand that gets input from the right hemisphere. The right hand no longer gets input from the right hemisphere. That would require the corpus callosum to be intact. And so the right hand just draws what a child draws, what it knows, a flattened out cube. The hand that all its life has been drawing cubes can no longer do it. Now, really, it's awful to do this, but because you're so kind as to invite me here, and because I owe it to you to try and compress as much as I can into this hour, I'm going to go very quickly through what the specific hemisphere differences are. It'll sound extremely simplistic, it will sound much too definite, but believe me, to make it substantiated and suitably nuanced would require 600 pages. Fortunately, I did that earlier, so you can go. So one of the main differences is between the known and the new, and in each case, abandoning the anatomically unhelpful convention, I am putting the left on the left and the right on the right. So in each of these dichotomies or dipoles, if you like, because they're not really dichotomies, that I'm putting up, there are dualities, if you like, of ways of thinking about the world. If I had to talk to you about it in a quick and dirty fashion, I'd say the right hemisphere is interested in the new and the left in what is already familiar. Now, this is a literal neuropsychological fact. Elkanon Goldberg, a very famous American neuroscientist, spent a decade researching this and can show that any new experience, before it is conceptually dead, before it is categorized, pigeonholed, when it's still alive and in that moment of presencing, is more experienced by the right hemisphere than the left. And as it becomes familiar, one of those, it shifts over into the left hemisphere. Of course, this follows partly from the fact that new things tend to come from the periphery, and the right hemisphere sees the periphery. Another difference which goes with it is that the left hemisphere prefers what is certain, the right what is possible. Ramachandran calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate, because it's always going, but it might or it might not be. The left hemisphere is going, for God's sake, I've got to make up my mind, it's got to be black or white. And you understand why that makes sense evolutionarily, because if it's the one that's involved in manipulation and predation, if it's got to get that thing before the next gets it, then it's got to be quick and dirty. It's no good going, well, it looks like a rabbit, but I suppose it could be a guinea pig, and I've never liked the flavour of guinea pig, so it's got to be, you know. So, and one interesting way one could think about this philosophically is many disputes in philosophy are about whether you really take a view of trying to close down on a certainty or open up to a possibility. And I would say that the left hemisphere helps us to close down to a certainty and the right to open to a possibility. I must say that we need both of these things. We wouldn't get anywhere if everything was constantly new. It's got to be familiar to us to some extent for us to be able to operate in the world. We have to have a degree of certainty, but we also need to be open to possibility. So we need both. That's why actually we've got both. So to this famous illustration, or made famous by Wittgenstein, you know, the right hemisphere is perfectly happy that this could be a duck or it could be a rabbit, but the left hemisphere is not happy at all. It's going, make up your mind. So one of the other differences, which again sort of goes with this, is that the right hemisphere is interested in flow. and the left in fixity. Now, flow is a fascinating topic about which I'm really interested and I'm writing at the moment, but I can't go into it in great detail. But basically, flow is the right hemisphere's suggestion that everything is changing, everything is mutable, nothing is fixed or certain. But the left hemisphere is able to deal with things that are static and fixed. Now, in everything, from a molecule to a cell to a human being to a society, we need a proper balance between flow and fixity. Fixity and everything ossifies, too much flow, too much change, and there's chaos. So we need to have these things properly negotiated. And in the phenomenological world, they're both very important. This illustrates what happens sometimes with the right posterior tumor or stroke. You develop something called, well, there are actually a number of different syndromes, but essentially there's one called palinopsia, which is quite interesting, where you see after images of things, so you see this hand moving as a succession of trails rather than as a single flowing motion. The right hemisphere tends to see things as a whole and the left as the parts. I mean, literally in terms of the body, the left sees the body as composed of a hand, an arm, a chest, etc., etc., whereas the right hemisphere sees the body as a whole. And in general, the right hemisphere has what's known as, I'm sure you know this, Gestalt perception, whereas the left tends to do things serially and analytically. Hands up anybody who knows this picture. Yes, not everybody, so it's worth putting up. Anybody frankly puzzled as to what it shows? Yep. Okay. I'm going to step down for a second from the microphone. It shows a Dalmatian dog. Here is its snout. There is its ear. There is its back, hind legs, forelegs, sniffing the ground in the shade of a tree. Now, very pleasingly, there were a number of aha coming from you, because that is what psychologists, being an imaginative lot, refer to as the aha moment, at which you see the thing as a whole. And you don't get that by going, this little black spot is part of a dog, this little black spot is part of shade. You simply can't do it. It's got to be seen as a whole. And when you have that pleasurable moment of insight, which you also get in solving a mathematical problem, doing a cryptic crossword or whatever it might be, it actually excites the right superior temporal sulcus and the right amygdala. It's the right hemisphere that sees the Gestalt. And this is just to demonstrate that there is a normal hierarchy of attention. You see the whole first, not the parts. Most of us see the H's before the E's, the 4 before the 8's. And this is a bit like, you don't go home to your living room and go in and go, a sofa, a TV, a lamp. It's my living room. You go in knowing what it is, and you then direct your attention to what catches your attention. So we generally see it this way around. There is an exception to this, which is in schizophrenia, which is a right hemisphere deficit state, in which people focus on the details first. So if you saw the E's and 8's, please have a quiet word with me afterwards. I have to say, because I am a medic, in my duty of care, is that there are many other reasons why you might have done so. Please don't lose any sleep. These are all drawings done by people with right hemisphere damage. So on the left you see a person. In the middle you see a bicycle where the pedals are larger than the wheels and the wheels are above the pedals. So the sense of how parts relate and their relative size and position is lost. And on the right, that's a house. We know that because it's got one of those pointy things on it, but that's about the only way you tell. So this is actually taken from a internet YouTube animate made of a talk I gave at the Royal Society of Arts in London, which some of you will have seen. But it really is to illustrate not only that the right hemisphere has this open, sustained, broad alertness to the world, whereas the left hemisphere is narrowing down to just looking at a detail, but that actually when patients have damage to their right hemisphere, the left half of space disappears, not because there's anything wrong with their vision. They can't they won't hear. They can hear, they can see, but they won't attend either orally or visually to things going on over on the left. If you want to talk to them, you've got to come over to this side. Now, that's an extraordinary fact. It's not that there's anything wrong, as I say, with the senses. It's that the attention is simply absent. And this applies to their own body. They will not attend to the left side of their own body. Sometimes so extreme is this, they'll forget to dress it, wash it, or shave it. And the opposite doesn't happen when you have a left hemisphere stroke, because the right hemisphere is still preserved, and the right hemisphere, if you remember, gets the whole picture. The left hemisphere is only interested in the bit of space it can manipulate, where the right hand goes to get things. Another difference is between the explicit and the implicit, and I think I've been over that. Explicit and implicit are very, very important, because most of the things that really matter to us, from love to religion to sex to humor to art, all depend on being implicit. When they're dragged into the spotlight of attention and dissected, they become something completely different. The left hemisphere abstracts from context, but the right hemisphere sees things in a living context. The left hemisphere tends to want to make general rules and put things into categories, where the right hemisphere sees the unique case. And there are some rather sad instances of this. I know two that come from Switzerland. One was of a farmer who, before his right hemisphere stroke, was able to tell each of his cows by name, but afterwards could only with difficulty tell a cow from a horse. And a woman who'd made it her life's work to know and write about all the birds in Switzerland, after her stroke said simply, in words that almost bring tears to one's eyes, all the birds look the same. Essentially, the left hemisphere is interested in the how, the quality, the kind of the nature of something, its disposition and character, whereas the left is interested in how many there are. The right hemisphere is mainly more interested in animate things than inanimate. The left hemisphere deals with both, but it is the only hemisphere to deal with tools and machines. So strong is this that even in left-handers who are in daily life using their right hemisphere to control their left hand, and therefore their tools and machines, nonetheless code tools and machines in the left hemisphere, not in the right. And there are 6 studies I know on this, and one of them makes a complete distinction between inanimate in the left and animate in the right, but it's more of a tendency than an absolute one. The left hemisphere is curiously optimistic, and the right not exactly pessimistic, but more realistic. So, for example, there's a procedure that's done in neurosurgery when you have to operate on the brain. You may want to know beforehand where the speech area is. Now, in most right-handers, the speech area is in the left frontal cortex, in Broca's area. That's 97% of cases. But there are still 3% that have it in the left. And in left-handers, 60% still have it in the left hemisphere and 40% in the right. So before operating, sometimes people carry out a procedure in which they inject sodium amytal into the carotid artery of one hemisphere at a time. And for 15 minutes or so, the hemisphere that's anesthetized is more or less not functioning. And so you can tell where speech comes from. But some enterprising neuropsychologists thought, while we're doing that, let's give them a personality inventory to each hemisphere and give it also to relatives and friends. And it turned out, when they looked at the results, that the left hemisphere had a very high opinion of itself, which wasn't shared by friends and relatives, alas. And the right hemisphere had a slightly pessimistic view compared with others, but it was at least more realistic. And this is a real problem because, for example, after a right hemisphere stroke, one of the reasons it's hard to rehabilitate people is they're not aware of what they can't do. They don't know what it is they don't know. And so that can be a huge stumbling block. And one of the most extraordinary examples of this is the way it leads to denial. I don't have a problem. So this is something that pretty much any medic in this room will have experienced. You go on a ward round in the morning and somebody's come in the night with a right hemisphere stroke. So you go to the bed and you say, "How are you?" And they say, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." And you go, "Oh, that's very good. Any problems?" "Nope." Any problems specifically moving your left arm, for example? "No, none at all." "Would you like to move it then, please?" And they go, "There, you see?" And you say sort of, "Well, I didn't see it, did you?" "No, I'm afraid we didn't see it. could you do that again? I go, there, see. No, you take the arm, bring it round in front of them and say, now move that. And they say, oh, that's not my arm, that belongs to the bloke in the next bed. I'm being serious. These are not people who are mad. It's just that the left hemisphere finds it very difficult to accept that there's anything wrong. That might ring a few bells as I continue. Now, the overall most important one is the one that you've been waiting for. And it is really intrinsic to the whole thing, which is that the left hemisphere's world is a virtual world. It is a map of the world. It is like a map simple. Maps are not better for having too much detail. They are better for simplifying. They show a few theoretical ideas. But the reality of what the terrain on the ground is like is quite different from what's on that map. And when things are present, or as Heidegger would have said, presence to us, and he had to invent a verb, anwesen, from the noun, to suggest that there was this possibility of things presencing. And it's not just being present, which has a quite different sort of feel about it. It's that the thing actually is immediately declaring itself to you and coming into being in your attention of it. Whereas a representation is literally a presenting later, something that happens afterwards. So the left hemisphere is always dealing with something that has been, that is no longer alive or pertinent, but is information that has been mapped. And the right hemisphere with the immediacy of perceptual experience. There's a lot to say about that. But again, you're getting a Cook's tour. Oh, that's probably a very English expression. Thomas Cook is a travel agent that goes back to the 18th century. And we say, you get a Cook's tour. It means, you know, sort of quick round the Mediterranean in 7 days. Now, so these are a little bit light relief in a way, because I've been a bit theoretical. Here is drawings of a tree done by patients with different conditions in which they were experimentally had one or the other hemisphere suppressed. So here we have a tree, and you can see that the left hemisphere's tree, which is in the middle, is not only existing on the right, which is rather nice, but is also a deeply symbolic tree. It's not actually like a tree. It's a rather withered-looking thing, whereas the right hemisphere's tree on the right is a more flowing, living thing, which has a sense of the organic whole. Here you see the same thing with flowers, which are reduced to symmetrical geometric abstractions in the middle, which is the left hemisphere's version, but still have the overall form of the whole on the right, with the right hemisphere. This is to show depth as better done by the right hemisphere. These are all by the left hemisphere, and if you just concentrate for a moment on the fourth column, you will see what a person becomes to the left hemisphere, what a poor, withered diagrammatic structure that person, the whole of that lived human being becomes. And incidentally, you can see on the left a few more flattened cubes, which is just makes the point I made earlier. Now, I want to make some reflections on hemisphere and language, just because you're, I know, very interested in that. And I want to just take you through quickly some ideas about it. First of all, language is not just in the... Oops, hello. Language, oh, Lord, that happened very quickly. Language is not just in the left hemisphere. So the story that it all had to be in that one place in the left hemisphere is wrong. We know that lots of aspects of language are subserved by the right hemisphere. Indirect meaning, metaphor, but also prosody, which is the intonation of the voice, and any kind of meaning, really, which is non-literal and explicit. The left hemisphere has, they both have semantics in the normal workaday sense of that word, although the left hemisphere has more extensive semantics, and the left hemisphere has very much more sophisticated syntax. But it's certainly not a case of all being in the left hemisphere. And indeed, pragmatics, which is how we really understand language, the understanding of an utterance as a whole in context, is very much right hemisphere driven. So it's capable of understanding what an utterance means in context. So, for example, I say, it's a bit cold in here today, and you think I'm offering with your left hemisphere interesting meteorological information, but what I'm really saying with my right hemisphere to your right hemisphere is, could we turn down the air conditioning a fraction, because I'm feeling frozen. So actually, you don't have to do anything to it. I'm feeling fine. But there are problems with that left parietal expansion being due to language. You know, you remember I showed you that bit of the brain that's expanded on the left? In medical school, it's all about language. Well, first of all, we know that you don't have to just put language in the left hemisphere. Lots of it's in the right. So the idea there has to be an asymmetrical expansion doesn't wash anyway. But get this. We know that skulls of pre-linguistic man show that expansion existed then. And we also know from scanning bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, that they have it, and attempts to make them speak have not been successful. They don't have a language. So both hemispheres are actually involved in this business of language in different ways. Also, it's been thought maybe that left hemisphere expansion is to do with handedness. But no, it's there, as I say, in apes that don't make tools, although some of them begin, I suppose. But it really can't be the explanation of it. And bizarrely, it's not actually an expansion. This is a really extraordinary thing. It's not that the left hemisphere is expanded at all. It's that the right hemisphere has actually contracted contralaterally to it. And we know something like 36 or so genes that are involved in that process of asymmetry there, and 32 of them are to do with making the right hemisphere contract. And when there's a failure of asymmetry, it's not that you get two small regions, it's you get two large regions. So actually having an asymmetry in which something contracts is important. So what was the underlying cause of this, and what do we know about language? Well, we know that 500,000 years ago, long before anthropologists believed there could have been language, Homo heidelbergensis had a big brain, actually slightly bigger than ours, and managed to do something rather more successful than we've done, which is to live together socially for hundreds of thousands of years without destroying the planet. And so they lived as social animals. How did they communicate? The answer that's rather odd, but seems to be coming out of anthropology, is through music. There are two things you need for language. One of them is the correct vocal apparatus, but the other is control over ventilation or respiration, over breathing. Now, it would seem very difficult to know whether man at 500,000 years ago had the capacity for being able to speak. But we know that they did. And the reason we know that they did is that from looking at their skeletons, nerves, putting it simply, get bigger when they have to do more work. And if they pass through bone and they're bigger, they have to make a bigger hole. So there is a hole there called the anterior condylar canal, and that is rather small in apes and in animals that can't speak, but it's large in humans, and it was large in humans a long time ago. And equally, there are foramina in the spine through which the nerves that give us control over our rib cage, which enable us to speak long sentences or to sing, these were present. We can tell from looking at the size of the foramina that they were there then, and they're not now in the greater apes. So the difference between us and them seems to be the capacity for language, but without having language. And what was that? Well, the anthropologists say it was music. It was the ability to sing phrases, long phrases, and to be able to articulate and make sounds. And through that, we communicated. One of the reasons we might think music came first is that music also is somewhat simpler in its syntax than language. And in general, there is a principle, it's not an inviolate one, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means that in each growing being, we recapitulate some of our ancestry. Some of you will know, others of you may be surprised to learn that in the in utero, you had a handsome tail at one point, which you then lost before being launched on the world. So as we know, newborns are very good at music. They're not good at language, and their mothers instantaneously know how to respond to this in something called motherese, which is a kind of language that has very large pitch excursions and is accompanied by rhythmic sounds and very vivid facial expressions. So this musical communication is what babies and their mothers do all the time. And the baby that can't understand language knows the mother's voice. If from the moment it's born, it can tell the mother from others. And it also prefers hearing its own language spoken, because in the utero it has heard its own language, and therefore prefers to hear, even though it hasn't learnt language, things being read in that language. So I know this isn't what Steven Pinker says, who said that music is just an exaptation of language, which is about as useful as pornography or cheesecake. I'd rather go with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Alexander Humboldt, and Otto Jespersen, who all thought that music was probably more important than language in terms of evolution. And it also explains something that I learnt at school, which was very odd, which was that, first of all, poetry always used to be sung, and that poetry came before prose. That was a very odd thought indeed, but in fact the Greeks called prose. They had to find a special term for it, because most communication, written and formal, was in a kind of music or verse. And they called the kind of written discursive language pesos logos, which means the walking logos, not the dancing logos. And another thing we might think about is, can animals communicate without language? It's always been said to be, you know, we have language and we can communicate, but animals can't. But bonobos actually have highly sophisticated social arrangements with one another, which they do manage without language. Killer whales can actually orchestrate attacks using musical sounds. Pre-linguistic children, as those of you who have toddlers will know, can communicate their meanings quite emphatically without language. Stroke sufferers who have lost language are still, even though they're at the double disadvantage of living in a world that's geared to language and knowing that their listeners don't understand things unless they're expressed in language, they're still able to make their needs known. And this is where we come to that slide. This is Dan Everett in the Amazon with the Piraha, who are a tribe who do have a verbal language, but they also communicate using music. And they use music over very large distances, because music can convey meaning in the forest to others who are hunting. And it's quite specific, and it is just done through pitch, tone, and using the mouth to make different sounds. So what I would say is that language is not necessary for communication, particularly in the I-thou situation. If you're in my presence, language is not really the important thing. And there are certain relationships, those with lovers and those with patients, that are very difficult done over the telephone, because a lot of the important information is simply phased out. A lot of the tonal subtlety, and of course you can't see the person and so on. So you can't see their face, you can't see what this pause means. So we communicate very well face to face in ways that don't necessarily depend on language. In fact, language can be an impediment. We go, oh, I don't know how to put it, and I can't find the words and all the rest. But when we are plotting together about it, the third person, that's over there, or him that we don't like, then having language is very important. So we don't need language for communication, but do we need it for thought? Well, I think this is a problem of introspection. When we introspect, we think we need words in order to understand, but in fact, we don't. Many great mathematicians and scientists, amongst them Weil, Poincaré, Einstein, Kekulé, and others, have seen answers to scientific problems or complex mathematical problems in a flash. They had an aha moment in their right hemisphere and spent literally weeks or months explaining how they got there, or more accurately, how they didn't get there, in language. Again, pre-linguistic men, as I say, were able to live together perfectly well without language. Pigeons can do the most extraordinary things without language. Animals of various kinds can, but I'm very impressed by pigeons. There's a lot of them around in Trafalgar Square. And I think I have a new respect for pigeons after writing this book, because I discovered that, of course, pigeons have to carve up the world. They have to be able to think about things and put them in categories. But they can do some rather sophisticated stuff. They can pick out an individual face in a crowd. They can actually categorize works of art. They can tell a Monet from a Picasso, and they can generalize from that, from a Picasso to a Braque, and so forth. And in England, there's something called the Turner Prize, which is annually offered. And I sometimes think that if they had a few pigeons on it, they'd make fewer mistakes. But also Karp, Karp can tell jazz from Bach. You might say, how do we know that? Well, they get rewarded with a puck. They hit the puck with their nose, and they get a little pellet of food if they get it right. So we know they can tell these things apart. They can, in fact, tell the Trout Quintet from Muddy Waters, apparently, although I think that the experimenters must have had a bit of a sense of humor over that one. Anyway, also, humans who have lost language don't lose theory of mind. They're not incapable of understanding that someone else thinks something that I don't know, and that what they think is that. And so they understand thoughts going on in other people's minds as well as their own without having the language. And chimps can obviously think and reason about things, but again, they don't have language. Then there was the case of Jacques Lorda, who was a professor of neurophysiology in Montpellier, who had made a study of aphasic stroke, the stroke that means that you cannot speak. And afterwards, he wrote a piece saying, I can no longer say that language is important for thought, because my thoughts were all there, ready to go, but I just couldn't find the words. Interestingly, there are tribes like the Munduruku in the Amazon who have only 1, 2, 3 many. And there are some of them that also speak Portuguese, but they can solve certainly quite sophisticated mathematical problems up to the value of 80. Just as well as the Portuguese-speaking ones, and of course the Portuguese-speaking ones have the whole language. So again, these things are not dependent on language. So what does it do? Obviously it's not necessary for thought, but it helps. It helps to delineate areas of thought immeasurably. And it helps us to communicate immeasurably more subtly, but it's not for those things. So what is it for? Well, my suggestion to you is that language has a very intimate relationship with the hand. Language, actually speaking, arises in the brain right next to the area that controls the right hand. And as has been noticed in children, Marcel Kinsborn made this observation, that children never babble without pointing, and they never point without babbling. It's thought also that actually speech comes from gestures of the hand. Ramachandran amazingly describes a woman who was born without limbs, and yet when she speaks, she can't stop her phantom limbs gesticulating, because it's so deep wired in the brain that these things connect with one another. Syntax is thought to derive from movement of the limbs. And of course in language we say, I grasp it, I understand it. Begreifen in German, comprendre in French, comprehend, which is to grasp something. So there is a huge, there's a whole slew of words in most languages that relate understanding to grasping something and therefore being able to manipulate it. And one thing I thought might intrigue you is that Norman Geschwind, a very great neurophysiologist, he said that probably we didn't have language for communication. We had language in order to map the world, in order to be able to use it. Now, I think that is a very profound remark. So there's different kinds of language. There's a language that brings precision and fixity, which is mainly in the left hemisphere. And there's a language that opens us up to what is beyond language, which is really more important than anything, which is metaphorical language. And all language at base is metaphorical. All language gets its meaning from metaphor. If you know the work of, somebody help me here, Lakoff and Johnson. Metaphors We Live By and Philosophy in the Flesh. Effectively, they are pointing out that all language, including and especially scientific and philosophical language, is metaphorical in nature. Metaphors are not a dressing for language, a distraction. They are actually the only way we can break out of the prison of language to the real world lying beyond it. They are all rooted in the body. Even the word virtual comes from a man's strength. Even the word material comes from wood, immaterial. So all these things are rooted in the body. And the right hemisphere's understanding and use of language is embodied, contextual rather than detached. Now, you've had a very long lecture, and I'm just going to wind up in literally 5 minutes. So I'm going to suggest, I'm not going to talk at all about the second half of my book, about the various developments through civilization. I'm just going to ask you to do a thought experiment. This thought experiment is, suppose we'd stopped relying on the ways of looking at the world and thinking about the world that the right hemisphere enables, and had got locked into thinking of a model which is conformative to the left hemisphere's way of looking at the world. What would that world look like? Well, there'd be loss of the broader picture, clearly. Knowledge would become replaced by information, tokens or representations, and wisdom would be right out because it's much too undependable, personal and embodied and not easy to measure. There'd be loss of the concepts of skill and judgment for the same reason, and they'd be replaced by algorithms that a machine could carry out. Not well replaced, but replaced. There'd be a simultaneous abstraction and reification. We'd spend an awful lot of our lives in terribly rarefied stuff, endless managerial prose full of abstract nouns without any concrete reference, and at the same time matter would be treated as mere lumpen matter, stuff there for us to exploit. Bureaucracy would have a field day because, according to Peter Berger, famous sociologist, it depends on these things, which are all essentially left hemisphere driven. There'd be a loss of the sense of uniqueness, which would be replaced by having to fill in a box. Quantity would become the only criterion of measurement. It would be hard to make a case for the quality of something. Either or would become the watchword. What do you mean? It's a bit of this and a bit of that. It doesn't fit in my box. Reasonableness would be replaced by rationality. I just need to gloss that slightly. In most languages, there's a possibility of separating these things. Certainly in German, there's a distinction to be made between Verstand, which is more like rationality, as I'm saying it, and Vernunft, which is reason, which used to be thought the chief aim of education and the greatest achievement of the human mind. And it was the bringing together of experience with the capacity to reason on the basis of that experience. But there are times when it is perfectly irrational to be rational. In the bedroom is a good start. And there are just plenty of places, if you start to think about it, where people are literally mad if they start to become over-rational. Damasio wrote about a patient called Eliot who had to reason everything from first principles. His life came to a standstill. There'd be a failure of that distinctly uncommon thing these days, common sense. Systems would be designed simply to maximize utility. Social cohesion, which depends very much on this empathic right frontal lobe in its ability to understand and communicate at a deeply empathic level with other beings, would begin to break down. Things would become less personal, and the left hemisphere would feel that it couldn't control everything and would become paranoid. Paranoid psychoses, when they happen after brain damage, almost invariably happen after right hemisphere damage, which is why in schizophrenia there is often paranoia, because there is basically a right hemisphere failure and a left hemisphere overdrive. Therefore, there'd be a lack of trust. Governments would want to have total control, including DNA banks and CCTV cameras on every street corner. The general mode of intercourse would become that of anger and aggression, because, in fact, the left hemisphere is not unemotive. It is deeply emotive. It gets very angry rather quickly. In fact, of all emotions, anger is the most lateralized, and it lateralizes to the left. We would see ourselves as the passive victims of other people's doings. not me, Gov, it belongs to the patient in the next bed, art would become purely conceptual. Visual art would start to lack a sense of depth, and there'd be distorted or bizarre perspectives. Music would be reduced to little more than rhythm, which is the only part of music that the left hemisphere is good at. Harmony and melody are highly dependent on the right hemisphere. It's different in professional musicians, but for most of us that is definitely the case. And actually it's an interesting observation that harmony and perspective in space came in with the Renaissance and went out with the 20th century. Language would become diffuse, excessive, lacking in concrete reference, like those 25 lever arch files of procedures that I have signed off as having read, but actually living somewhere in a cupboard. There would be deliberate undercutting of the sense of awe or wonder, which just annoys the pants off the left hemisphere. What do you mean you don't understand something? It's just that we don't know enough yet. But I think the wisdom of the right hemisphere is the things that are intrinsically unknowable, intrinsically uncertain, and intrinsically awe-inspiring. Flow would just become the infinite series of pieces instead of a living flow. We would be discarding all tacit forms of knowing. Life would become strangled by what de Tocqueville presciently in 1830, whatever it was, called a network of small complicated rules, which would sap the will of a people. And we'd all, as Descartes proudly said of himself, become spectators rather than actors in the world, sitting on the sofa with a six-pack. And all this would be accompanied, apparently, by a dangerously unwarranted optimism. Now, thank God we're not in that world, but just imagine if we were. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.